How a man born in poverty, trapped by the shadows of misunderstanding and suffering, managed to illuminate the path to divine union. The life of St. John of the Cross is a story of struggle, faith, and celestial poetry that touches the hardest of hearts. In this account, we will discover how a humble soul reached the most sublime heights of divine love, leaving a legacy that continues to transform lives centuries later. Prepare yourself to immerse in a journey where darkness is not the end, but the beginning of eternal light. 1. The mystic who defied darkness, a man named Juan. The life of St. John of the Cross begins in the year 1542 in Fontiveros, a small town in the province of Avila, Spain. He was born under the name Juan de Yepes Alvarez, the son of a humble weaver and a deeply faithful woman named Catalina. His family lived in extreme poverty, especially after the premature death of his father, which left Catalina alone with 3 children to feed. From a very young age, Juan demonstrated an exceptional ability to endure suffering without losing his sweetness or determination. The loss marked the early years of his life, but also shaped his spirit. Despite the difficulties, Juan developed a serene and reflective character. He spent hours helping his mother with her tasks, but also found time for contemplation. He was fascinated by observing nature, as if searching for traces of the Creator within it. He was known in the village for his kindness and a special brightness in his gaze, as if he were connected to something greater than himself. From a young age, his spiritual sensitivity was evident. In moments of greatest need, he found refuge in the local church, where sacred images and liturgical chants nourished his soul. The priests who knew him were impressed by his intelligence and early inclination toward faith, encouraging him to follow the path of service to God. Although his family lacked resources, Juan's mother did everything possible to provide him with an education. He was sent to an orphanage school, where he learned his first letters and developed artistic skills such as drawing and painting. These tools, though humble, would be fundamental in his future monastic life. However, what truly marked Juan in this stage was not the academic learning, but the strength of Catalina's maternal love and her unwavering faith in providence. This example of dedication and sacrifice would deeply inspire him, preparing him for the trials he would face in the future. 2. The humble childhood forging the spirit of a saint. In 16th century Spain, being poor not only meant material shortages, but also exclusion and hardship in all aspects of life. In this context, Juan de Yepes grew up, facing adversity from day one. Although privations were a constant, his mother Catalina never allowed despair to dominate their home. She instilled in her children a profound sense of gratitude and trust in God, teaching them that faith could be a source of strength even in the most difficult situations. From childhood, Juan stood out for his willingness to help others. He was often seen caring for the sick and showing compassion that few children his age possessed. The community, though also struggling to survive, recognized in him a purity that moved them. He was frequently found in the church, kneeling before the altar, in a silent dialogue with God that seemed endless. Hunger and cold marked his body, but his spirit remained steadfast. His moments of solitude led him to deeply reflect on life, developing from an early age a unique understanding of human suffering. These years not only hardened his character, but also planted in him a special connection with those who suffered, a characteristic that would define his ministry in later years. However, his life was not devoid of small moments of joy. Nature was his refuge, and he found in the landscapes of Castilla an inspiration that nourished his soul. Starry nights, gentle breezes, and the singing of birds were, for him, a kind of prelude to the celestial beauty he so longed for. As he grew, this humble and reflective boy began to perceive within himself a calling that he did not fully understand, but that filled him with hope. Although he did not yet know it, he was destined to walk a path that would lead him to become one of the great mystics in history. 3. The divine call, a young man in search of something more. Juan's adolescence was marked by a constant search for meaning. Despite the limited opportunities his environment offered, he always felt that his life had a higher purpose. This longing led him to deepen his studies and actively participate in the religious life of his community. Gradually, he began to understand that his destiny was linked to a radical commitment to God. At 17, Juan entered the Carmelite order, convinced that this was the path that would bring him closer to divine love. Monastic life, with its long hours of prayer, work, and austerity, was a burden for many, but for Juan, it was an oasis of peace. He found in silence and contemplation a depth he had never known before. During his formation, he stood out for his intelligence and dedication. His superiors quickly noticed his ability to understand spiritual truths and his skill in explaining them with surprising clarity. He was sent to study theology at the prestigious University of Salamanca, where he immersed himself in the teachings of the great doctors of the Church. However, what set Juan apart was not only his academic knowledge, but his ability to integrate these teachings into his daily life. He did not settle for knowing. He sought to experience God in every aspect of his existence. This approach led him to develop a mystical thought that went beyond rules and traditions, focusing on the inner transformation of the soul. As he advanced on his path, he began to feel that God was asking something more of him. This call was not a literal voice, but a deep inquietude that pushed him to seek a more radically committed lifestyle. It was this impulse that prepared him for the great challenges that would mark his mission in the Church. 4. The encounter with Saint Teresa, an unforgettable spiritual alliance. Fate wanted Juan to cross paths with Saint Teresa of Avila, an extraordinary woman who, like him, felt the urgency to reform the Carmelite order. This encounter, which took place in the year 1567, marked a before and after in both their lives. From the first moment, Teresa recognized in Juan a kindred spirit, someone with the strength and wisdom necessary to undertake such an arduous mission. Teresa, who had already begun founding Reformed convents, needed a collaborator who shared her vision of a more austere religious life focused on prayer. Juan, with his humility and passion for spirituality, was the perfect candidate. Together, they formed an alliance that would not only transform the Carmelite order, but also leave a spiritual legacy that endures to this day. The relationship between them was not without difficulties. They faced criticism, opposition, and obstacles both within and outside the Church. However, their unwavering faith and mutual support helped them overcome each challenge. They shared long conversations about God, spiritual life, and the sacrifices necessary to achieve holiness, creating a connection that went beyond the earthly. Juan learned much from Teresa, especially about the importance of perseverance and humility. She taught him to see trials as opportunities to grow in holiness, a lesson that would be crucial in the darkest moments of his life. Thanks to this alliance, the foundations of the Carmelite reform were laid. Although both faced great sacrifices, their joint work bore abundant fruit, renewing the order and guiding countless souls toward a deeper relationship with God. 6. The prison of Toledo, suffering as the seed of divine poetry. In the year 1577, Juan de la Cruz was arrested by his own Carmelite companions who opposed the reform. He was taken to the Toledo convent, where he was confined in a tiny dark cell with barely any ventilation and inhuman treatment. There, under a regime of extreme privations, he began one of the most painful and at the same time most fruitful stages of his life. The cell where he was confined was barely a space to stand or lie down, and the food he received was scarce and of poor quality. Additionally, he suffered constant physical and psychological mistreatment. However, amidst this suffering, he found a deeper connection with God. Juan understood his pain as participation in the Passion of Christ, which gave him the strength to endure the unbearable. It was during this experience that he composed some of his most sublime poems, including The Dark Night of the Soul. Without access to paper or ink, he memorized his verses, which were the fruit of deep contemplation and the spiritual union he experienced with God. Every word he wrote or remembered was a flash of light in the midst of darkness. The months in prison not only transformed his relationship with God, but also his vision of suffering. He understood that true freedom did not depend on external circumstances, but on the soul's ability to find God even in the most adverse situations. This teaching would become one of the pillars of his spiritual legacy. Finally, after 9 months of captivity, Juan managed to escape from prison in an act that many considered miraculous. Despite physical and emotional scars, He emerged from this experience with renewed spiritual strength and a clear message. Even in the worst circumstances, God's presence is capable of transforming pain into love. 7. The Dark Night of the Soul, a journey inward. The Dark Night of the Soul is not only one of St. John of the Cross's most celebrated poems, but also one of the most powerful metaphors of spiritual experience. In this text, the saint describes a process of deep purification where the soul, facing darkness, ultimately finds union with God. This concept, born from his own experience in prison, became a beacon for countless believers seeking comfort and hope. For Juan, the dark night is not a condemnation, but a necessary step on the path to spiritual perfection. In it, the soul is stripped of all attachments, pride, and earthly desires, making space for God to enter and completely transform its being. Although the process is painful, it is also the prelude to indescribable joy. Through his verses, Juan portrays the soul's struggle as an intimate dialogue between the human being and the divine. Every word is imbued with a beauty and depth that invite the reader to reflect on their own spiritual life. His poetry is not just literature. It is a guide for those seeking to understand the trials of faith and the grace that arises from them. The most striking aspect of this concept is its universality. Although it emerged from a particular mystical experience, its message transcends time and cultures, offering comfort to those going through moments of darkness. For Juan, the night is a preparation for dawn, a transformation that can only be achieved through absolute trust in God. Over the centuries, the dark night of the soul has been interpreted in many ways, but its essence remains intact. It is an invitation to let oneself be guided by God, even when the path seems uncertain. This message of hope and faith has made St. John of the Cross a central figure in Christian spirituality. 8. The verses that touch the heavens, the poetry of contemplation. St. John of the Cross is recognized not only as a saint, but also as one of the greatest poets in the Spanish language. His verses, written in simple yet deeply symbolic language, are an expression of his mystical experience and his love for God. For him, poetry was not just an art, but a form of prayer and contemplation. Works like Spiritual Canticle and Living Flame of Love capture the essence of the soul's union with God. In them, Juan uses images drawn from nature, such as fire, water, and light, to describe spiritual realities that transcend words. His ability to combine literary beauty with theological depth has made his poems studied and admired by both mystics and literary critics. What makes Juan's poetry unique is its ability to touch the heart of the reader. His words invite the reader to experience God's presence in an intimate and personal way. It is not about abstract concepts, but about a living and vibrant relationship that transforms the entire being. Furthermore, his poetry reflects a central paradox of the Christian faith. Suffering and love are intertwined. Through his verses, Juan teaches that true love does not avoid pain but transcends it, finding in it a source of grace and redemption. St. John of the Cross's poetry is not only a literary legacy, but also a testimony of his life. Every verse is a reflection of his soul, a window into the intimacy of his relationship with God, and an invitation for others to follow his example. 9. Mystical visions between the human and the divine. Throughout his life, St. John of the Cross experienced mystical visions that left a profound mark on his spirituality and his work. These visions were not mere extraordinary phenomena, but transformative encounters that led him to better understand the mystery of God and his presence in the world. One of the most well-known visions occurred during his imprisonment in Toledo. Amidst his suffering, Juan had an experience of union with God that he described as a touch of love so deep that it completely transformed his perception of reality. This vision gave him the strength to endure trials and became the inspiration for some of his most sublime poems. For Juan, visions were not an end in themselves, but a means to deepen his relationship with God. Through them, he understood spiritual truths that he later expressed in his writings. These experiences allowed him to see beyond the material, showing that the divine reality is much more vast and beautiful than we can imagine. However, the saint was always cautious when speaking about these experiences. He knew they could be misinterpreted, and that ultimately faith does not depend on the extraordinary but on daily trust in God. Therefore, he insisted that true union with God is achieved in the silence and humility of the heart. The mystical visions of St. John of the Cross are a testament that holiness is not just an unattainable ideal, but a reality accessible to those who fully open themselves to divine love. Through his life and work, he invites us to seek this union with God, not in miracles, but in daily fidelity and love. 10. Love as the central axis, the union of the soul with God. For St. John of the Cross, love was not merely a feeling, but the very essence of spiritual life. All his work and ministry revolved around this truth. The ultimate purpose of the human being is to unite with God in perfect and eternal love. This message, so simple in its formulation, is also profoundly transformative. In his writings, Juan describes union with God as a spiritual marriage, where the soul and the Creator become one. This love is not a mere desire, but a total surrender that demands sacrifice, humility, and complete purification from all earthly attachments. Only in this surrender can the soul experience the fullness of divine joy. Juan's vision of love was deeply influenced by his personal experience. Through his trials and sufferings, he discovered that true love is neither easy nor comfortable, but a powerful force that transforms even the deepest wounds into sources of grace. For him, loving God meant embracing the cross, not as a burden, but as a path to freedom. In each of his poems and treatises, St. John of the Cross reminds us that divine love is the only one that can satisfy the deepest longings of the human heart. This love does not eliminate suffering, but redeems it, turning it into a means to draw closer to God. Through his life and work, St. John of the Cross left a legacy that continues to inspire millions. His message of love transcends the barriers of time and space, reminding us that ultimately, the purpose of our existence is to unite with God's infinite love. 11. The enemies of the Reform, the cross of rejection. St. John of the Cross dedicated much of his life to the reform of the Carmelite order, an effort that brought him not only admiration, but also fierce opposition. Many within the order saw his proposals for austerity and continuous prayer as a direct attack on their comfort and tradition. The criticisms were not just words. They translated into conflicts that tested his spiritual strength and commitment to the mission God had entrusted to him. The enemies of the Reform were not limited to ideological opposition. In many cases, they resorted to more aggressive strategies to hinder his progress. Juan was subjected to public humiliations, false accusations, and even imprisonment. However, far from being intimidated, he embraced these trials as an opportunity to more fully identify with Christ. What made Juan so unshakable was his total trust in God. He knew he was walking a difficult path, but he was also convinced that he was not alone. Every blow, every betrayal was for him a way of bearing the cross, an expression of his love for God and the Church. Despite the difficulties, he never allowed resentment or bitterness to poison his heart. He continued to work with humility, convinced that true reform was not achieved through confrontations, but through example and prayer. This attitude disarmed many of his opponents, who eventually recognized the sanctity of his cause. The cross of rejection was a constant in the life of St. John of the Cross, but it was also the instrument through which he attained holiness. Through his perseverance and unconditional love, he left a powerful example of how to face adversity with faith and courage. 12. The death of a saint, an immortal legacy. St. John of the Cross died on December 14, 1591, at the age of 49. Despite his short life, he left a spiritual and literary legacy that continues to illuminate humanity. His death was peaceful, like that of someone who had fully fulfilled his mission on earth and was ready to enter the presence of God. His last days were marked by physical suffering due to a severe infection, but also by a deep peace that impressed those around him. As the moment of his departure approached, his words reflected a total union with God. He died surrounded by his Carmelite brothers, who recognized in him not only a leader, but a man of God in all his fullness. News of his death spread quickly, and soon stories of miracles attributed to his intercession began to circulate. People from all social conditions flocked to his tomb, seeking comfort and strength in his example of life. For many, St. John of the Cross was not just a saint, but a celestial friend who guided them on their spiritual path. After his death, the Carmelite order experienced a renaissance inspired by his message of renewal and love. His writings, which were subjects of controversy during his lifetime, began to be recognized as masterpieces of Christian spirituality. The Church, aware of his impact, initiated the canonization process, which would culminate decades later. The death of St. John of the Cross did not mark the end of his influence, but the beginning of an even more powerful presence. Through his work and intercession, he continues to touch hearts and bring souls closer to God, showing that true love is stronger than death. 13. The impact of his teachings, changing lives centuries later. More than 4 centuries after his death, the teachings of St. John of the Cross remain an inexhaustible source of inspiration for millions of people. His focus on the purification of the soul, contemplation, and union with God has resonated not only in the religious sphere, but also in fields such as psychology, literature, and philosophy. His writings, translated into numerous languages, have been studied by theologians, scholars, and mystics from all traditions. Works like The Ascent of Mount Carmel and Spiritual Canticle are considered literary and spiritual gems that offer clear guidance for those seeking a deeper relationship with God. What makes his message so relevant is its universality. St. John of the Cross does not limit himself to a historical or cultural context. He speaks directly to the human heart, touching the deepest longings of those who read him. His teachings on the dark night have helped many people understand and accept moments of suffering as part of the path towards spiritual fullness. In a world increasingly marked by haste and superficiality, one's words are a reminder of the importance of silence and interiority. His life and work invite us to pause, reflect, and seek the essential, union with God. And the impact of St. John of the Cross cannot be measured in numbers or statistics. His influence is found in every soul that has found comfort in his words, in every life that has been transformed by his example of love and sacrifice. 14. Canonization, the recognition of holiness. The canonization process of St. John of the Cross began shortly after his death, driven by the numerous miracles and testimonies of faith associated with his intercession. The Church recognized in him not only a reformer and poet, but also a true saint, someone who fully lived the gospel and guided others toward holiness. He was canonized by Pope Benedict XIV in the year 1721, nearly 130 years after his death. This recognition not only confirmed his place in the Church's sainthood, but also highlighted the relevance of his message for all humanity. In 1926, Pope Pius XI declared him Doctor of the Church, a title reserved for those whose teachings have profoundly enriched the Christian faith. This honor underscored the importance of his writings as a guide for spiritual growth and the search for God. The canonization of St. John of the Cross was a moment of celebration, not only for the Carmelite order, but for the entire Church. It was a recognition that his life, marked by suffering and dedication, was a model to follow for those seeking a deeper relationship with God. Today, his figure remains a source of inspiration. His canonization was not just an act of the Church, but a confirmation that his legacy transcends time, inviting each generation to walk toward union with God. 15. How to approach God through the life and devotion to St. John of the Cross. The life and teachings of St. John of the Cross are a beacon for those seeking a deeper relationship with God. His message transcends time, showing us that even in the midst of the deepest darkness, divine love is present, waiting to be discovered. Through his example of humility, perseverance, and total surrender, he invites us to reflect on our own lives and take concrete steps toward a more intimate union with the Creator. One of the first steps to approaching God, according to St. John of the Cross, is detachment. In his writings, he teaches us that we must leave behind the distractions and earthly attachments that distance us from true spiritual freedom. This process is not easy, but it is essential to create space in our hearts for divine light. Prayer also plays a central role in this journey. St. John of the Cross encourages us to practice contemplative prayer, a silent dialogue with God where our words transform into listening. In this silence, we can feel the loving presence of the Creator and allow His grace to transform our lives. Devotion to this saint can be a powerful guide. By praying to St. John of the Cross, we not only ask for his intercession, but also connect with his spiritual legacy. His poems, writings, and life examples invite us to contemplate the greatness of divine love and seek it with all our being. Finally, faith and trust are fundamental. St. John of the Cross teaches us that even in the dark night, we must remain steadfast, knowing that these trials are necessary steps toward a deeper union with God. By following his example and seeking his intercession, we can find the path to the eternal peace and love that only the Creator can offer. A typical prayer to St. John of the Cross reflects his deep spirituality. O St. John of the Cross, Master of the dark night, you who traverse the shadows with the light of divine love, guide my soul toward union with God. Teach me to trust in Him even in the darkest moments, to accept trials as paths to His eternal embrace. Pray for me that my life may be a reflection of the love that transforms and saves. Amen. The faithful find special comfort in this prayer, as it reminds them that even in the most difficult moments, they are not alone. St. John of the Cross walks with them, guiding them toward the light of God. His intercession is especially powerful in situations of suffering and spiritual confusion. Those who invoke him often speak of renewed peace and clarity that allows them to face their challenges with hope. Through prayer, St. John of the Cross becomes a bridge to heaven, a spiritual friend who shows us that darkness is not the end, but the prelude to eternal light. His life and legacy invite us to fully trust in God, reminding us that divine love is capable of transforming even the darkest nights into days of glory.